All right, we're live. Hey, what's up? So, I'm George.
Justin.
And
I'm Tim.
We have a special guest for our second ever episode of hanging out and talking about our favorite thing. Can you give a little intro, since Justin and I already did an intro last time? So.
Sure thing. I'm Tim. My formal title is Director of Adversarial Engineering. Oh, dude, you got like chirons and everything. So I'm the practice lead for network penetration testing and red teaming at Lars. I used to be fully technical. Now I'm slightly less technical, hands-on keyboard, and dealing with more statement of work generation and some of the managerial side. But I still stay technical where I can, still get involved and throw down with the team and try to come up with some really weird and unique attack paths and techniques and things that may not be listed on public frameworks.
Man, I feel you on that. And we've talked about this before, right? Both Justin and I are now have a C in our title, and it's like we have to like manage people, and they're a lot harder to manage than endpoints that we compromise.
It is, but I look at it as a force multiplier. Is if I can divide, if I can like help 10 people work better and more efficient and stronger, then I'm okay with that.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. I'm going to turn it over to Justin because he actually prepared. And look, there's Bryson.
Oh, Bryson's here.
Welcome, Bryson.
Tim, why you didn't get the memo? We're wearing red.
No, I didn't get the memo. I figured I was going like blue tie-dyed.
I got
that works.
Red teaming shirt on.
Oh, dig it.
All right. Yeah, so this week we decided that we would try to dig into like C2. We all have a lot of different experiences, a lot of different knowledge, and from talking to my coworkers and blue teamers and things like that, we might make some choices and do things a certain way, and people might say, oh, that's just how they do it. But there's a lot of like institutional knowledge we have from doing this for a while. So we're just going to talk through, we took down some notes, just kind of have some conversations around, C2, how we do things now, where things are going, things like that. So I think first off, we say C2 and most people say, HTTPS, SSL, TLS, maybe DNS. I think that's because majority of us are in the enterprise space, right? So, the attackers in the real world going after home endpoints, probably a little bit different traffic patterns, fast flux, things like that, trying to, deal with takedowns on a quicker basis. And, we're kind of going a little bit different route because enterprise proxies and things like that. Is HTTPS your go-to, Tim, or is that, you guys still a mixed bag?
It's still a mixed bag. It depends on the client. HTTPS is definitely the go-to, just because it's there and it's I say fairly well open anywhere. We've hit some clients that are starting to lock down web traffic from like hourly employees, contractors, things that don't, or folks that don't need internet access, and those are a little bit harder. DNS is still used, like stageless DNS, for kind of initial recon and getting an idea of where you're at, and is HTTPS allowed outbound, and then you can make some probes to see what domain names can you reach over HTTPS, can you enumerate their internal proxies and hard code those in. But we've also had some experience. I worked with a client last year who allowed database.azure.net outbound, and so we spun up something real quick to do C2 over database traffic to Azure, because we figured, mature clients have good beacon detections on HTTP traffic. They're looking for DNS tunneling, and so let's go with a protocol that they might not be monitoring as hard yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we talk about this a lot, or tweet about this a lot, is that everybody's moving to cloud, right? And there's so much traffic that places will exempt, ignore. And basically anything you can put data to is, potential C2. Like, so Microsoft kind of did this weird thing where they used the same top level domains for clients as they use for some of their services, which causes some confusion. Most other major cloud providers will give you, like a test account or API account or dev account. So we've done some stuff there. Like if you're, big into like using Zoom, things like that. So, Zoom's on every workstation, very high traffic. You can set up an API account. So think of that expanded across every cloud service you use these days. Interesting times for that piece.
Yeah, I did a data exfiltration over the Zoom chat. Wrote a quick PowerShell script to take a chunk of data, base64 encode it, paste it in a chat, and then Zoom is nice enough to give you an export chat function on the client. So on the receiving side is just save that base64 decoded after you rip out the timestamps and names, and there's your data. But yeah, you could use that for C2 as well.
Yeah, George, are you coming across any cloud stuff for C2 lately, or just experimenting, looking around?
Yeah, no, definitely figuring out what's allowed out. And, just to highlight something that Tim mentioned briefly was, DNS, using DNS for very low level, right? You can't do like a full operation on it, right? It's just so slow. At least I'm not patient enough for that. Same with like ICMP, right? Most organizations don't allow ICMP, but planes kind of do when you connect to those paid services. But anyway, figuring out like what is allowed and what's not, and big point, right? A lot of cloud services are, because you can't block them at scale, and they pop up all the time. So I did work quite a bit in organizations that, one, have proxies, right? Most enterprises I'm working with have a proxy. So whatever you build has to be proxy aware. And then from there, using and going to domains that are going to be allowed, that aren't going to stick out, and really adding and trying to make the traffic fit in, because that's something else we were talking about. Like C2 traffic over any communication doesn't really look like HTTP traffic, right? And we can't really make it look like that. Maybe we could talk a little bit about how we do that, other than going to a cloud service. Obviously, that having that outbound access, awesome, we can hit it, but is it going to look like all the other traffic that's going to that same cloud provider?
Probably not.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? You look at the existing, profile, so Cobalt Strike or Public Tools, it's always like a GET request or a POST request. You go to a website, any website nowadays, you never do a single GET that loads a single website and that's it, right? You got JavaScript trackers. So I'd assume that's going to be the next evolution of some of the C2 frameworks, is trying to look somewhat more realistic. And then the other good point you brought up was, trying to match the traffic versus the client, right? So if you are a DevOps heavy, you're going after a DevOps heavy company, maybe, Git is a better use of C2 versus something else. Or, companies like that might allow SSH out versus your traditional enterprise that doesn't. So trying to match, what you're doing versus the client, kind of give them a, realistic thing. And I think, you're going to see the whole shift in going this way, right? So everybody did domain fronting for a while. Companies kind of caught onto that, locked it down. Everybody took a step back and realized that, all those CDNs let you use a top level, like whatever.companycdn.com. And that's good enough in most cases. You don't need to worry about trying to domain front Microsoft or trying to domain front whatever company. So it kind of pulls back some of those legal issues around that as well for, authorized testing. And I think that there's that implicit trust in the top level is kind of going to be the next thing that everybody needs to sort out. I'd love to see like a Microsoft-client.com or something like that, or like Azure-client.com, and not have any overlapping services. But that's just maybe that's a pipe dream now, but I think it might go that way.
I think it mixes things up when you're looking at like infrastructure as a service offerings versus platform versus application as a service. Is how do they differentiate that? Because you want to be able to dynamically spin up things like databases or Kubernetes instances or things in the cloud and so clients are going to have to allow outbound access to randomname.database.azure.net. So it's definitely a problem that the industry needs to try to wrap their head around and figure out a good solution for it, to allow a dynamic infrastructure without allowing wildcard access to domain names.
Yeah, and you just gave me an idea. I wonder if anyone's actually done this. A comment you made, Justin, is very true. We all knew this, like a C2 just reaching out, sending that one GET or POST and being like, hey, give me instructions, and then sending various different size. But right, it's not that one request, right? Like you look at one request to whatever site, and it's going to a bunch of other domains as well, pulling all this other stuff. So is there a C2, or is there anything that kind of does that, just kind of as like a, false flag, right? Where you are going to your initial C2, getting the info, but every request out, you're also like pulling out other stuff. Have you actually ever done that? Or is that like an idea that you just came up with?
No. So we've been looking at this, because if you look at beacon detection, right, you look at a period of time and you look for a bunch of reoccurring, you can do some jitter, but again, that's looking for a single URL request. So we've been looking to how to beat those things long term, right? Like as machine learning and things actually get better and do what they claim, looking at large data sets should fix this. So we've been experimenting with doing that, right? So doing padded requests. Hey, we need to do 5 or 6 requests of different file names, extensions, to make the traffic look more realistic. Obviously, it's not needed yet, but if you look at all the attacks out there, there's always C2. Anytime a attacker's interactive, there's always some form of C2, and that's one thing. If you're going to invest in, I mean, you can go after that, right? There's people want to focus on hey, look, there's this print spooler attack. Okay, cool. They're in your network. They need C2 traffic, and you're kind of corralling people in these couple channels, right? Whether it be DNS, whether it be HTTPS. Hopefully you have egress filtering. So hopefully, there's you're not allowing just everything out, right? Still happens, but you're corralled into a couple areas. So try to pick those pieces of traffic apart.
So I'm gonna borrow Tim's blue shirt here and give a little bit of the other side of this. So this is my fireside talk I gave several years ago at ShmooCon actually followed what you were just saying there, Justin, which is, I mean, the one place an attacker can never hide is the network. And of course, command and control today is absolutely critical for them, because we're not yet there where the machine learning is going to be something that's embedded in that implant or that payload from the red team operator. So in terms of what the adversary might do or what the red team might do, we're not quite there to allow these things to go off on their own. And then there's, of course, a whole other host of questions around scope with the client for a red team to have a machine learning payload. And so command and control is absolutely critical. It's the one place that an attacker can't hide. I have to go to ones and zeros to communicate like everybody else, and I have to communicate. If data exfiltration is a part of my campaign scope, then of course that's 99.999% of what I'm going to be doing, taking close access and out of band stuff off the table. And one thing I think that a lot of defenders also get a little defeated about is when we talk about HTTPS or any other encrypted comms. And they're like, oh, well, I have no way to get into that traffic stream to see what's happening. But you don't need to be able to identify anomalous behavior, right? There's a lot of metadata around that can identify something. There are even simpler things like traffic that's happening outside of normal operating hours, traffic going to particular geography, a way that just thinking of like SolarWinds, which is, of course, what are we up to now? Like 4 or 5 giant attacks this year. Is it even beyond that? I can't keep track. Nobody can. But SolarWinds is, I think, a classic example of a real world natural limit, because the initial egress that was there went to a trusted domain, right? And that's, of course, what we're all trying to do as red team operators. Is part of that is finding the right protocol to blend into that environment. So we have to follow what's there. If we try to do anything particularly sneaky, like if you were to use Tim's Zoom approach at an enterprise that only used GoToMeeting, well, that probably, that's going to stick out if he did, in fact, find somebody with a Zoom client. But the round trip delay for the C2, which, of course, was going back to Mother Russia, right? You can't defeat the laws of physics. So that's the kind of thing that the packet delay on the back end, even though the initial bounce node was, in fact, valid, is a giveaway, and you didn't have to inspect the traffic, right? That metadata is there, and that's something that we as red team operators also need to be thinking about, is not only just how we're blending in, but all of the components of OPSEC around what that is for testing with the client. And I got a question for Tim on this one. So actually, hold on real quick. So just because George didn't announce it earlier, 2 other ones that we've used was we had a Google Sheets that we were using for exfil. Unfortunately, Google deprecated that. That's what Google does to everything. Whatever you glob onto, Google changes its mind. So that one's dead for us now. And then we also use Twitter. And this kind of had limitations as well, which is what I wanted to get to. The question with Tim is, of course, you couldn't send commands the other way through Zoom, right? You were only able to do limited data exfiltration through the Zoom chat, right?
For that one, yeah, that was just an exfiltration exercise.
And what were the constraints and what were you able to get out from that?
Oh, anything. So Zoom limits the text chats to 1024 characters. So I wrote a probably 30-line PowerShell script to take a binary blob of data, zip encrypt it with a password, take that, chunk that up, base64 encode it, chunk that up into 1024 bytes, and then just send message, just like BB send keys. So pretty simple, but it was effective and kind of showed, it was a fairly well locked down client, and they wanted to know, show me all your weird exfiltration techniques. So there was a project by Pen Test Partners that would do screen flashing, that it would take a binary blob of data, encode it into a JPEG. You could show that on like a VDI screen or something, take a screenshot of it remotely, and then decode that. Like there's been a handful of really weird esoteric, I'm going to say exfiltration channels, but exfiltration bidirectional can be used for C2.
Has anybody else here used Stego as a C2?
I did.
Not as
like 20 years ago, I wrote a VB6 project to do it.
And it still works today.
You probably need to bring the runtimes with you, but yeah, it probably still works.
Yeah, that's funny you said that about the base64 thing to get data out, because a lot of clients want to test DLP solutions, so you'll build test cases and it fails on the second one. The other interesting point is, so mixing and matching C2 with cloud services is also a potential path in the future, right? So maybe use Exchange or O365 for signaling, and say you need to upload a large file. Do they use Box? They use Dropbox? OneDrive? I think you're going to see a future of mixing and matching to kind of, hey, the client uses these things, let's enumerate them, and let's kind of match to what their traffic pattern looks like. And that's kind of a departure from the traditional, hey, we're going to stand up some redirectors, classify some domains, manage a big domain database of age domains. So it makes things a little bit easier for attackers. It's just kind of a different line of thinking. I think you're still seeing in the real world people deploying Cobalt Strike directly to the internet, not using a redirector. There's opportunity there with JA3S signatures on the server. And then I think you're going to see the shift slowly over time as, CDN and things like that become more popular for real world attackers. You have companies that are doing red teams and things like this kind of ahead of the curve because they're seeing the evolution here. It's only a natural path.
I always wondered that on the JA3 signatures, right? Like how many customers, I know, ballpark, because you all do the consulting world side, right, are actually looking at that? Like, is it a lie? Is it 50%? Is it 80%? Or is it no one's really looking at those signatures?
The ones I've seen look at them because they have an appliance that does it, right? They have something that enriches network traffic or something, is just doing it on the fly. So I've seen, places pull, they've had us test Cobalt Strike in a basic configuration, test it with this profile, seeing a ransomware, test your custom C2, test with redirectors, things like that. And I mean, some of those products do a good job pulling that stuff, right out of thin air and saying, hey, this is a Cobalt Strike server, this is beaconing traffic. So I think it's going to get there. I don't think the awareness is there that if something's not behind a redirector, something like Cobalt Strike, easy to detect with this. This is not like it's open source, it's well documented, it's out there. I don't think the knowledge is out there to everybody.
Which essentially brings us to the advice of always use a redirector, right? Never put your C2 out there directly. If you redirect through, some Python or some anything, right? You're essentially going to be using those signatures instead of the signatures of that particular C2 on that particular configuration. But I think, Tim, you were going to say something?
No, I was going to say on the JA3 signatures, or JA3, I don't know the proper pronunciation for that. But yeah, on the JA3 signatures, I've seen semantic network threat protection. If you're trying to connect directly to a Cobalt Strike server, we'll block it. But as soon as you tuck it behind a redirector or anything, even with the same profile, it's still allowed through. So they're obviously doing some sort of network level detection that it's connecting to a Java Cobalt Strike port, but I don't know details on what it was blocking.
Yeah, and I think it's JA because it came from the initials of, I can't remember their names, but it came from their initials, right? Yeah.
JA3 then.
Yeah, exactly. And for anyone that doesn't know what we're talking about, this is fingerprinting the TLS communication of when you do that initial handshake based on the implementation of TLS that you're using, etc. You can actually fingerprint it out. And that's actually something we track on the C2 matrix on the per C2. But again, if you use a redirector, then that kind of goes out the door, right?
Yeah, to kind of circle back for a minute. I'm sorry, Justin, go for it. Keep talking.
No. I was just going to add that. So the JA3 is the client side and the JA3S is the server side. So the JA3 probably not as useful in the Windows side because so many things use Windows libraries unless you maybe wrapped Python or something. However, JA3 is probably way more useful in a Linux and Mac environment. And the JA3S is, again, depending on redirectors. But Tim?
No, I was going to just following up on the tailoring your implant to the environment. Adam Chester's blog post that he put out on tailoring Cobalt Strike on target. That blog post and library has been awesome because you can basically build it into your payload. That when you land on a box, you can go ahead and profile what processes you see running on the box. What processes you see will give you an idea of what domains they communicate with, and then you can tailor your Cobalt Strike shellcode in your implant and then inject it into one of those processes. So for example, if you've got Slack in an environment, then you can use maybe F-Secure C3 and Slack and inject that into the Slack process to minimize your likelihood of standing out. But yeah, that blog post is a gold mine for identifying what is in an environment, where you can live in the environment and how you can blend in, and then throw an Nginx redirector in front of that kind of catches a bunch of different URIs and then redirects those back to the consistent URI on the back end for Cobalt Strike. That's money.
That was another thing that I actually wanted to talk about too. When you said, you use Nginx, some people use Apache. Everybody's kind of moving towards automation. I'm a fan of automation, but I'm also a fan of if you're, you do engagements with people quarterly, or you're changing things up. A lot of times you fall in this trap of using automation. Hey, we only use Apache. We only set it up this way. Our redirectors always look the same. Or the other thing, which just happens more in the real world with attackers, is they make a mistake, right? So the Cobalt Strike web server at one point had an extra space in it. There's always opportunity to do that. So anytime you build something like this, I would always ask to have your whole team review it, maybe scan it with Nessus, have everybody step through it, because it's easy to build, mistakes in that are identifiable in the future. And if you're, trying to do threat emulation for different clients, maybe change up the redirector kind, maybe change up the way it acts on a 404, things like that. So you give people, a different experience. It's not easy to, match it back to who you are. And so something to think about there. It's just giving people a more realistic experience. If you're trying to work out the IR team, if they instantly go, hey, this is XYZ company that tests us, we know it's them because the redirector is in Amazon, it's Nginx, the automatically redirects curl to this, that sort of thing. There's a lot of opportunity there to kind of mix things up a little bit. And I think people get so into automation, say, hey, we clicked a button, we stood everything up, perfect, let's walk away. I think there's definitely some areas to help teach both sides on that piece to kind of keep things alive.
Yeah, I'm a fan of automating the mundane. Only automate the things that you don't want to have to do over and over again. But automating infrastructure is kind of that gray area for those reasons.
Yeah, actually, that was the question that I typed up to ask. While there are challenges to automation, I think part of the challenge is, has anybody found any good tooling to be able to spin up and manage the health of your redirectors? Yeah, this is something like it's been in my head for years to build something, and I keep thinking that somebody else has built it or is going to build it, and it's just it's such a mundane IT management piece that is just such a pain in the butt for red team operators everywhere, and it's such a critical component of all the campaigns we do.
I looked into this before. There are some web front ends for Terraform in some of these, but you're talking about purchasing or setting up some massive product suite to manage to use a 10th of the feature set. So I do agree. I think that it would get there. I'm hoping somebody probably will come from the DevOps side of just, hey, I need a cool GUI. Is everything up and running? What's this look like? Are my redirectors working? That whole thing. It'll probably come from some DevOps project by accident. I don't know if anybody will invest all the time from the OffSec side to build that out right now. I think most people are just using Ansible or Terraform to roll things out.
Still handcrafted artisanal C2 servers here, and
the remix.
You audio DOSed us.
I'm sorry, but yeah, for some reason my phone took over Bluetooth from my headset, so I just disconnected it. I'll deal with it later.
Throws phone into wall. All right, so we talked about HTTPS. We mentioned DNS. I think that depending on the organization, I think a lot of people think DNS is, kind of dead. You use it for real-time C2 and you're kind of, you're making a bunch of traffic. It stands out. Probably run the top of like a top talkers list. A bunch of really maxed out, DNS queries, doesn't look great. I think where we've seen people, innovate here is, purely using DNS for signaling. So say you run a macro, the macro fails, maybe it sends back some data. Perhaps you have something more complicated like a stage 0. It grabs a PC host name and maybe some other metadata off the system. You can encode on that data later. I think we've seen a lot of red teams innovate in that space, using it for kind of out of band signaling and failover, not so much real-time operations. There's some stuff, DNS over HTTPS, might breathe some life back into that, but so far from talking to people, they're really just kind of blocking it up front. So.
Yeah, and some of the other protocols, right, we're seeing kind of show up, right? I think if it's an enterprise, if they already have a proxy, right, if they're using the next gen firewalls, right, that have app IDs or whatever X vendor calls it, right? I think it's very easy for them to block things that are new and don't have a use case, and then kind of work their way up of like, oh, there's a use case, then you get access to it and you have to request that over here and whatnot, which is the complete opposite of approach of how we kind of got to where we are, which was everyone gets internet, right? You get internet, everyone gets internet access. And now organizations are like, wait a minute, why do you need internet access, right? So a lot of stopgaps I've seen for that is new person starts, like if they need internet access, you have to request it. And that way you track who has internet access, who does not. Same for external email. Like large companies that do, some people might not even need external email, and you're really limiting the surface. So I think that's what's going to occur with things like DOT or DNS over TLS and all these other ones, right? The HTTP2, HTTP3, et cetera.
Yeah, we've already ran up against a large bank who they don't allow internet access outbound by default, and they give a dedicated PC to people who need internet access that isn't tied to their corporate network. And so those are difficult. Yeah,
we did that. It was a particular country that had that. They had 2 workstations, which I thought was very difficult to, like, how do you do this? But hey, it worked. It took us a while to get access. We ended up having to target another country and then pivot internally to where we needed to go. But yeah, it cost us time, it cost us resources, and that's generally what most defenders are trying to do anyway.
Agreed.
So I had some notes here about like mixed bag issues. So traditionally C2, you're going outbound, right? So you're on a workstation, you're on a server, you're going back to the C2. There's situations where you might get a hold of a host in a DMZ that has limited outbound access but unlimited inbound because it's a web server. So there's things like external C2. I think people kind of forget about, where you might be able to put like a PHP page or an ASP page on, and your external C2 connector hits that page and it exchanges data that way. I think that's not a common scenario that people think about. You'd probably look weird in your web logs, but I think that, as a defender, you're usually thinking things are coming out the other way. So, that's something that probably get lost. Have you ever used anything like that, Tim, or seen anything like that in the wild?
Driven from a web shell. And so give me a web shell that launches PowerShell and it's take over the world. So yeah, my kind of favorite C2 is no C2. Let me use what's there and use like PowerShell remoting the bounce between boxes.
Fair enough. I've also seen with work from home, right? So this is a weird one. So traditionally you intercept, traffic, you might have an IDS, those things, with people working from home now with COVID and everything else, some companies opted to do split tunnels. So we've run into engagements where company had really strong network detections. We were able to, get access to a MAC, change some routing around. Even the VPN client didn't fix that, and then basically put all of our C2 out the home internet. So those definitely scenarios there. A lot of the VPN clients are stronger on the Windows side where they'll fight you on the routing, but Macs, don't really care. So there's some area there. I've seen, people try to use guest wireless before, where the corporate configuration would let you, join guest wireless and be on the corporate network, right? So these are things to, consider. That one's interesting because, maybe you want to keep all your corporate devices off the Wi-Fi. So it's kind of a policy thing to keep them off the guest Wi-Fi, to keep your controls in place. I think that a lot of people do Wi-Fi testing and don't really consider that one and the reasons behind it. But, it should kind of be, guests should kind of be an untrusted network and, have some controls around it, at least for your enterprise equipment.
Yeah. Like you mentioned, the one I have experience with is Cisco's AnyConnect, where you can actually force it to only have one connection, whether it's Wi-Fi or plugged in. Obviously, it prefers to plugged in. It's all configuration, but never could you have multiple connections going at the same time. So that was a fun one. That was more of a product pen test. And then the what they call the always on VPN, right? So someone has a corporate laptop, it can connect to a Wi-Fi at Starbucks or Starbucks. We always say that, right? It's always the example. But as soon as you connect, it goes out to the VPN. If it doesn't connect to the VPN, then it just simply doesn't connect. So that was a little race condition issue we found on that was fixed. But yeah, it's all about implementation and trying to test things out and figuring out ways to get your traffic and get your comms going.
Yeah, the no split routing is on the Cisco AnyConnect client specifically is frustrating because if we've landed a fish on an endpoint and the only time we could get C2 traffic out was whenever it was disconnected from the corporate network. But whenever they VPN'd in, the domain name or something wasn't working. We didn't have proxy settings right. And so whenever they VPN'd in, we didn't have C2 traffic because it was now redirecting all traffic out their primary internet gateway. So it's a think on the fly, reshuffle, and change things up whenever you can.
Well, of course, with COVID and everything is remote now, and hopefully for those that are, can continue to stay remote, I mean, VPN is also another great one. How have you targeted VPN access to look like a remote employee coming in? And just on that back, putting my blue shirt on, Tim, I'm going to keep borrowing it. I cannot recommend enough to companies to not treat VPN as the only segmentation you need and to basically just a flat network topology, that you really should have that coming in to almost like the equivalent of a demilitarized zone and then allowing additional access required for particular resources. But back to the VPN question.
So I'll say I have a trick here. So if we run into clients where they do like geo restrictions for logging in, right? So if I try to log in from New York and your company's in California and nobody's ever been there. So if you ever type city name and VPS, you can always find IP addresses that are sourced from that area. So we've done that with some success. And unfortunately, that doesn't have an easy fix. I mean, obviously the IPs are, don't match, with cable modems and things like that. But we've went through the lengths to control reverse DNS to kind of match a cable modem name or something like that. Something to be aware of on the offensive side to kind of break some of that geofencing, geolocation stuff. Just about every major city, even small cities, you can get an IP address in that city if you poke around, quick enough. Everybody's got a VPS provider that's local.
Yep. Same. DigitalOcean, Amazon, like you can find something that's close, or you find one of the smaller providers. And then for VPN, it's going to be snagging creds, multi-factor push authentication, or stealing a machine cert. So if we can land on a box with the fish, escalate privileges, pull the machine cert, then Cisco, sometimes the organization's configured to allow the machine to VPN in, and you can use the Open VPN client, Open Connect on a Linux box to VPN in, and then you've got connection into that environment, as long as they're not doing like host checking or anything.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the certificate side on the device, right? So, two-factor login, but still have the VPN client validate a certificate, because if you guys all know, if you fish the right person or you get their creds and you keep sending 2FA requests, eventually they get annoyed and hit OK. Or if you target it, say, hey, they start working at 8:30 every day, I'm just going to start sending them at 8:30. Somebody clicks through. So having that extra layer there on the VPN to assume that two-factor is going to fail, right? I think the whole thing with security is assuming something will fail, then what's the next control? What's the next step going to take? It's, building things to go, okay, two-factor, can't be beat. Okay, right, people will move on to something easier. But in the event that it does, what are we going to do? So it's kind of assume it's going to break first approach and, push through and see what happens.
Yeah, it's definitely a make no assumptions methodology. Just because you think something is secured and protected, okay, we'll send that 5th push notification, because they might get frustrated with you and accept it, and they have. same thing is if you've got a call and you've got to ask somebody for a 2FA token, and you can keep calling them back, and as long as you're friendly and helpful. We had one of our guys actually troubleshoot I believe it was a WMI issue on a box from somebody while he was phishing her multi-factor tokens, and she kept having problems, and he would call her back, and he would help remote into her machine and fix it for her, and it was a beautiful relationship that they built.
You brought up a good point there. So this happens a lot. I think we talked about it before, where red teams will fish somebody, and the pretext is so good, and the person wants to be helpful, that the rest of the email exchange will be screenshots of, hey, I clicked enable, it didn't work. Oh, okay, well, let me fix something, back and forth. And that once you show that example to executives or anybody else, and the person was doing everything right, they were trying to be helpful, they were still being cautious, like, it gets people to understand that you're going to find somebody who's going to click something. So maybe we should have, things in place, application whitelisting, some other controls. Maybe this person can't run macros at all, ever, no matter what they do. Creating more scenarios where, somebody's going to fail. We should plan ahead. And there's been a ton of cases where we've had just back and forth exchanging, like, 5 or 6 emails, maybe a phone call saying, hey, I've tried to run this several times. We're just generating different payloads with different, target EXEs or something like that, because it keeps getting blocked. And eventually land on one, and the IR team or the security team might not follow up, and the person says, hey, I had some problems, but you know what? IT helped me fix it. So security's like, oh, okay, well, whatever, and moves on. So just a life lesson.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the build stronger technical controls and technical systems to prepare for human behavior, and not pushing the buck back on people for failing phishing awareness tests or anything.
Yeah, I had, jumping around, I had another note here with the automation thing. One of the things that seems to happen in the real world is people who deploy ransomware and things like that will occasionally tar up and zip a directory and redeploy Cobalt Strike like that. One of the things that does is have the same license key and the same indicator, so it's easy to match the profiles. You can pull some information back like that. So something for defenders, if depending on how you're deploying things, if you're not regenerating like an authentication key, or the authentication, the beacon key inside Cobalt Strike, that signature is the same. Obviously, you can extract some information some other ways as well, but there's lots of situations like that where attackers are not used to doing the DevOps style, using Ansible, creating things cleanly and starting over. They're just tarring a directory and moving it. So there's opportunity there for you to extract some artifacts and kind of say, hey, this is definitely bad. They keep deploying it like this. So write signatures that way as well. Anybody have any closing thoughts, final thoughts, additional thoughts? Future C2 traffic. I know I had quick IPv6 and DNS over SSL. Twitter seemed to think that most people were going to block quick, or right now they do.
If Twitter's like the #1 source of InfoSec news.
Yeah. I think it's easy right now to block it. I'm assuming, in a couple of years, it's going to be so common, especially with, Google kind of has all of the browser control at this point, right? So if they decide, hey, everything's going to use quick, or it's going to be super slow and buggy, then, here you go. Better jump on board. So
we still see Webdav open at perimeters outbound. And so if you've got Webdav open, then your C2 is basically a batch file on a scheduled task on a client that just reads from that file share and runs whatever binaries in there. Like there's a whole bunch of esoteric options, and what's old is going to come back and is going to be new again.
Yeah. I come from a network engineering background, and I mean, I did that 12, 13 years ago, and I kept hearing, IPv4, we're going to run out of IPs, be on IPv6 quick. People run IPv6, and I think that most of the time they don't even realize it. I know there was some C2 options over using like the Teredo tunnel, because it did, some UDP encapsulation and kind of let people have IPv6 access. I mean, I think if that ever comes up and it actually comes mainstream, I mean, that's going to be the next thing, right? Because we're still fixing, IPv4 parsing issues. Once people move to v6, there's probably going to be a whole myriad of, initial like C2 methods and other things. I love watching the bugs pop up for IPv6, because they're like, hey, we fixed this 20 years ago in IPv4. We didn't really learn anything, and here we are again. So I don't know if we'll ever see this shift. Do you guys have any thoughts if IPv6 is ever going to be a 50% of internet traffic, 60, all of it? Is that
I had high hopes back in the day. I was part of an organization that we participated in World IPv6 Day. We IPv6 enabled all of our servers and endpoints. Like there was a ton of effort behind it. But I think now it's mostly going to be academics and research and less corporations. People are more reliant on NAT than they are keeping the true meaning of what the internet was meant to be for peer-to-peer communications.
Are you saying that NAT's a security boundary?
NAT is not a security boundary. It's not designed to be, but that's a whole different rant.
George, Bryson, NAT a security boundary?
No,
security?
no. It's not. It's just translation.
Yeah. Yeah, but we did the same thing, right? We looked at IPv6 and it got to a point where, we're like, just disable it. We're not going to run this in the internal network for the foreseeable future. So anything you put out, just disable it, because most people have it enabled. Like your iPhone, your Android phones, your Windows 10 and Windows 11, at least by default, has it enabled. The fact that nothing else talks to it is definitely not a security boundary either. But yeah, we went with just disable it on all internal systems because we're not going to use it. We don't have any visibility of it, and it's just going to be another. It just adds to the attack surface that we already have too much of.
Yeah. I was hoping this would take like an offensive, forward lead where like offense beats up on a new thing that comes out so heavily initially that it would be fixed. I think the surface of IPv6 is so big, you're probably not going to see that. You saw a lot of that with like PowerShell, where the whole industry kind of went after it. I think they kicked off a timeline that they shortened the timeline overall to get better security in PowerShell. I think you might see that right now with like DNS over SSL. You saw a lot of proof of concepts when it first became a thing in browsers to say, hey, we're going to tunnel some traffic this way. Here's a proof of concept. You got the awareness out there very quick. So people started figuring out how to solve or at least be aware of that. And I think a lot of these, as these technologies emerge, people from Twitter, researchers all over the world kind of jump on them and say, hey, here's a bunch of holes. Everybody's aware. What can we do? As opposed to, it gets rolled out and then a couple of years later we're like, oh man, this whole thing is a disaster. What are we going to do now? So I think getting ahead of some of these emerging tech for traffic is going to be very fruitful for organizations in the long term, right? You see it come out and you automatically see a bunch of bugs or a bunch of ways to avoid IDS and whatnot, but it gets people thinking, and then that'll get additional researchers into it, and by the time it comes around to mainstream, you'll hopefully have some of that patched up, or at least the awareness.
I'm hopeful. I like the idea, but I think in reality, consumers companies are going to be reliant on a small number of network security vendors to implement detection for that particular protocol and abuses of that protocol. And I mean, you're probably 5 to 10 vendors tops, and they're the ones that have to move the needle for defense. Offense collaborates on Twitter very well. Defense doesn't have that open collaboration and information sharing and knowledge because they're trying to sell it and not give it away.
Fair enough.
So until somebody comes out with a quick IPS IDS, I think we're going to be stuck.
It's interesting room for thought there without getting into an OST debate.
We're going to have to do that on one episode. I mean, it's just, I think, obligatory. We might want to get a few of these under because I already see Justin's face because we've had some side chats on this, but I think that'll be the one we want to build up to like a huge episode.
Like a Christmas episode.
Yeah, Christmas episode.
I'll free up my weekend and the following week to talk about it.
I'm just going to mute Twitter for like a week afterward.
Yeah.
No,
yeah, everything's a multi-sided issue, right? Depending on where you're sitting and looking at it. I think everybody is just, I think the argument with everything in security is what the outcome is going to be. And I think people weigh the outcomes differently. So. But we can save that one.
There are a lot of ways to get to a lot of different outcomes. And I think anybody who has a purist perspective is going to miss the nuances.
Well said.
Well, awesome. This was a little more structured than last time. Thank you, Justin, for putting down those notes, and Tim for coming on. And yeah, I think this wraps it up.
Awesome. Right. Thanks for the invite. I enjoyed it.
Awesome.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you all.
Bryson, George.